the scribe's voice cut the hush. "We accuse the Holy One of allowing our children to die." The parchment trembled in Jonas' hand as candlelight struck the stain along its fold. Outrage tightened the occult researcher's jaw. He did not speak, but he set his pen down and leaned forward, fingers pressing the table as if to hold the room still. The accusation declared a concrete demand, an answer, an accounting, for a massacre that had shredded the town 3 nights earlier. Within those first sentences, the central problem stood exposed. Can a people fashion a legal charge against their deity and expect an earthly form of judgment to follow? The researcher kept his voice inside his throat and let his pen move instead, recording names and timestamps as the scribe read. The cold open left the assembly in a brittle silence broken only by the rasped parchment and the soft intake of breath. The occult researcher catalogued what he saw. Jonas' knuckles white around the roll, Miriam the widow's shoulders pressed forward so the coins in her lap clinked. Rabbi Elias' mouth set in a line he tightened and relaxed as if testing a prayer. He had traveled to small, ruinous communities before, but never to a room that turned prayer into accusation in real time. His hands moved to the margins of his notebook. His notes would need a different grammar, legal rubrics, not only theological citations. Outrage began to govern his choices. He leaned toward confrontation when the notary moved to close the document, and he leaned back when Miriam's voice broke the assembled calm. "Miriam, Jonah," turning the page as if to steady her. "We need the facts precise. Who saw the carts at what hour?" Miriam's knuckles turned white on the edge of the bench. "I saw the carts myself," she said. "I prayed at dawn and at dusk. My son did not come home." They answered nothing. She spat the last clause like a bitter seed. "We ask not that God be torn, but that God be asked. Why did you let them die?" The room shifted at her words. Rabbi Elias stood and stepped forward. "You speak carelessly," he said. "You would drag the name into the street." The occult researcher watched Elias' lips, the way he formed each syllable with a scholar's care rather than a judge's fury. Rabbi Elias' rebuke started the first sharp exchange. "Rabbi Elia," Miriam shot back, "my son is in the ground." "Your words do not dig him up," Jonah attempted to interpose. "Shelter the form," he urged. "If this is to stand, it must follow law." Ephraim, young and raw, gripped the torn prayer, scroll in both hands. "Law." He burst. "What law catches a God's hand?" The notary raised his ledger as if it offered armor. "We are men of record. We will not be reckless." A tight, rapid back and forth followed. 3 lines of quick, cutting dialogue. Rabbi Elia warning, Miriam answering, Ephraim demanding, each line short, edged, revealing how thin the room's restraint had become. The occult researcher wrote every short exchange. He wrote how Jonas' voice wavered when asked to read the formal indictment. He wrote Miriam's exact words about failed prayers. He wrote the way Rabbi Elia folded his hands and refused the theatricality of a trial without legal scaffolding. He also recorded details most historians would toss aside, the way Jonas' ink, stained thumb left a crescent on the parchment, the smell of smoke mixed with unwashed wool, the small brass ring in the notary's belt, its surface worn by habit. Those specifics mattered because they shaped motive and method. The researcher believed that outrage alone could not drive a community to such a public act. It needed procedure, precedent, a ritual skeleton to hold the accusation upright. When the assembly voted on whether to proceed with a public trial or to abandon the accusation, the air tightened into a careful, ugly arithmetic. Jonah called for order. "Those who wish a public ritual say aye." Hands lifted. Jonah hesitated, then called for the opposing vote. The notary's ledger opened and closed with a measured slap. Rabbi Elias' hand remained down. Miriam's arm trembled when she raised it. The occult researcher registered the split and the consequence of that split. Authority would be redistributed by choice. He recorded who voted and who refused, aware that these names would appear in future transcripts and be used as proof of legitimacy. Doubt moved behind his eyes now. doubt about whether a legal form could contain a question directed at the infinite. Later, Jonah led the researcher to a cluttered table to photograph the indictment. Inkpots rolled in a faint line across the wood, and a magnifying glass lay buttery with fingerprints. As the researcher crouched, he noticed marginalia scrawled in a cramped hand. Snippets of procedure, formulaic rubrics, the kind of short lines a notary would repeat to himself as a prayer or a checklist. He traced the letters with his fingertip. These are court phrases. At Jonah, they modeled this on the secular trials of debts and thefts. They borrowed the form to give the act authority. The researcher tightened his chin. He photographed the margin and then read it aloud softly to test its cadence. The words transformed in his mouth from pious complaint into legal instruction, so the accusation borrows its bones from law, Rabbi Elia, when the two returned to the hall. He had a book in his hand and placed it on the bench with a small, decisive thud. We will not mock the name with theta. If you insist on judgment, you will give it form. The argument that followed turned sharp. Jonah argued that form compelled attendance and testimony. Miriam insisted that ritual made reality answerable. Ephraim paced the floor and called out, "If the law can bind a debtor, it can bind a God's contract." The notary demanded proof of precedent. Rabbi Elia refused to provide spectacle. He wanted formal procedure and an official record. The conversation moved in short sentences, each exchange revealing the fissures in trust between spiritual and civic authority. Ephraim's impatience supplied the next rupture. He darted forward and seized a torn prayer scroll from the pile with a hard, red-rimmed hand. "This paper spoke lies to us," he said. And he lifted the scroll as if to burn it. The notary stepped in, grasping Ephraim's wrist, and the room erupted in a physical scuffle. Jonah shoved his elbow into a shelf to steady himself. Rabbi Elia pushed between the two with the authority of someone who feared bludgeoned Ephraim. "Drop it." The notary ordered. "Ephraim, you will make us criminals." "He will not stand for words that failed us," Ephraim replied. The researcher moved to separate them, feeling a pull between his training as observer and the need to prevent further harm. He touched Ephraim's forearm and felt the child's bones under skin, tight and shaking. The scuffle ended with Ephraim pulling back, and the notary holding the torn prayer scroll like a damp rag. Miriam's lips were pressed together as she watched. Sweat stood on Rabbi Elias' temple. The researcher wrote down the gestures, who touched whom, which fingers trembled, and then took a photograph of the tear in the scroll. The tear would later be cited as evidence, a physical representation of trust sundered. For the first time, doubt shifted toward fear. If a ritual escalated to burning a prayer, what would the community sanction next? The researcher felt his breath quicken. He closed his notebook for a moment to steady his hands. Dawn arrived with a hollow light that cut across the hall. The assembly had moved to the empty throne alcove, bringing with them a scaled emblem carved from iron that they placed on the dais. They set the emblem as both symbol and instrument, the closest they had to a judge's scale. The occult researcher watched while Rabbi Elia arranged the candles, and Jonah read a short, formal rubric he had copied from the marginalia. They completed the symbolic verdict by placing the torn prayer scroll opposite an empty space reserved for the divine. Then an event happened that none in the room could explain. A single manuscript page, lying under the iron scale, twitched and lifted as if moved by a breath. Everyone in the hall froze. Miriam's hand flew to her mouth. Ephraim swallowed and stepped back. Jonah's fingers dropped from the roll he held. The researcher took a single photograph with a trembling hand. On that page, in a cramped, careful script, a line of ink formed a sentence that read like an answer. A short notation, no more than a few words, written in the same hand as the marginalia, but placed directly beneath the scale S shadow. The notation described a legal condition and a conditional punishment in a tone that read neither wholly liturgical nor wholly secular. It seemed to address the accusation itself. Silence widened into a pressure that showed itself in small, physical ways. Rabbi Elias' fingers uncurled, and he sank to the nearest bench. "This is superstition," he said in a voice that had lost its heat. Miriam moved to the manuscript and forced a laugh that sounded like a bark. "It writes like a man," she said. "Who among you knows a hand like that?" Jonah stepped to the lectern and read the line carefully, syllable by syllable, as if parsing a contested law. "It references a litany of obligations," he said. "It names a penalty. It uses legal formula." The occult researcher listened to the words and felt his outrage turn inward into a new emotion, curiosity sharpening into a clinical, almost hungry attention. He recognized the moment. The uncanny sign had already altered the distribution of authority in the room. Factions formed in the next hour. Rabbi Elia retreated to his prayer alcove and set his books in order with a hand that trembled slightly. Miriam left abruptly, slamming the door of the communal hall so hard the candles flared. Ephraim called for public enforcement and drew a small crowd at the door, banging on the latch to gather others. Jonah stayed behind to catalogue the manuscript and to show the notation to anyone willing to look. The notary argued for restraint and official summons. The occult researcher stood in the corridor and watched each exit and entrance with a ledger in his hand. He measured who left and who remained, aware that these movements would be taken as votes in an ongoing, unwritten trial. As factions splintered, a surprise emerged that changed how the researcher understood the earlier exchanges. Jonah admitted, quietly into his palm, that the marginalia he had copied came from an older, secular clerk's manual he had encountered in a monastery a year earlier. "I thought the forms might help." Jonah, breath low. "I did not expect script to answer on its own." The researcher stopped and asked, "Where did you find that manual?" Jonah named a town 2 days' walk away. That revealed motive. Jonah had deliberately imported procedural language to lend a charge weight. The revelation reframed the accusation as a constructed instrument, not merely a spontaneous cry. The researcher's doubt shifted again, doubt to worry clarity about human design beneath supernatural claims. The next external event occurred when a visiting notary arrived mid-morning, summoned by the town notary's messenger. He carried a sealed letter from a neighboring magistrate asking for copies and clarification. The new notary inspected the scale, the torn prayer scroll, and the notation with an expression of professional interest. "You have a form here," he said plainly. "But forms require witnesses. Where are your witnesses?" Miriam stepped forward and named 3 who had seen the carts. The notary smiled, a quick, dry curl of the lips. "Then you have testimony. Proceed formally, or you create a rumor that law must later correct." He advised the assembly to set a date, to summon elders, and to file a record with the magistrate in the neighboring town. That administrative intervention gave the assembly a path toward formal procedure and signaled that secular authorities could be drawn into what had begun as a community ritual. The notary's presence forced another confrontation between Rabbi Elia and the assembly. "Rabbi Elia, Jonah, the notary says we must record." "Recording does not mean profaning," Elia answered. "If you tie the name into civic writ, you will invite others to judge what only prayer should hold." Ephraim spat back. "What has your prayer held?" The exchange grew fast and barbed. 3 to 5 short lines bounced between them, voices snapping as they traded assertions. The researcher observed how language shifted from theological to bureaucratic within minutes. How the notary's ledger and Rabbi Elias' book found themselves serving the same function: to give a contested claim legible authority. Afternoon moved into an exhausted evening. The researcher retreated with Jonah to photograph the marginalia again under a candled microscope, recording the exact sequence of rubrics. Jonah sighed and ran a thumb along the edge of the parchment. "We borrowed law because law matters in the eyes of men, Jonah. When a god cannot answer, men will make a court to demand an answer." The researcher pressed him. "Did you expect the script to move on its own?" Jonah's answer was a short line of speech that in itself felt like a confession. "No, but we did expect that the form would force an answer from those who had power to answer. Their debate ended when Ephraim returned with several young men to demand public enforcement. The new arrival caused a fresh external surge. Footsteps, a door flung, voices in the hall. The cliffhanger occurred when Jonah opened a secondary folio and found a note bound between the leaves. A clerk's notation about a ritual trial held decades earlier for a noble accused of sacrilege. The notation contained an explicit instruction for holding a community accountable before a symbolic bench. The discovery rewired the researcher's assumptions. This accusation was not an improvisation but built on precedent, a twist. The assembly's ritual quoted a civic practice used to discipline elites, now inverted to address the divine. The twist forced new calculations: who had access to those manuals, and why were they repurposed now? It was a concrete change in how the researcher and listeners understood the event. Night closed with the hall half empty and the candle stubs guttering. The occult researcher sat alone at a ruined lectern in an annex, the original indictment folded and stained by soot. He slipped it into his worn leather satchel. His breath was firm, his hands did not shake now. He had catalogued testimony, photographed marginalia, collected names, and tracked the split in authority. Outrage had propelled him into the room. Doubt had pushed him toward method. Curiosity and a growing, controlled resolve now directed his next move. He resolved to trace the ritual's legal precedents and origins, to walk to the neighboring monastery Jonah had named, and to follow every clerk's notation until he either found a human source or a sequence of human decisions that explained the uncanny sign. He strapped the satchel closed, checked his brass pocket watch that kept slow time, and stepped into the chill dawn corridor with the indictment as his compass. Outside the communal hall, dawn pooled like cold oil across the cobbles. The notary shouted to a few farmers who had come to watch. Ephraim's group argued at the gate. Miriam's door had closed but not locked. Its loosened latch promised she might return. Rabbi Elias' lamp was visible through a cracked window as he began his prayers. The occult researcher walked away with the indictment on his shoulder and a list of names in his head. The night had resolved one small conflict. The community would proceed, formally or informally, to demand an answer. The chapter closed on a concrete beat, his hand adjusting the strap of his satchel as he headed toward the road that would take him to the next source. Rather than on empty reflection, the trial's immediate contest had concluded. The question of origin, of precedent, now drove him forward. Jonah hammered the stained parchment to the wooden gate and began to read the charges aloud. We accuse the Holy One of allowing our children to die. Outrage rose in the crowd like a physical force. Men stepped forward, hands clenched, and a woman spat at the hinge. The occult researcher stood at the margin, ink on his fingers, and felt that same outrage shape his next decision. Record, translate, protect. The accusation at the gate was not rumor now. It was a public ritual with a name and a nailed scroll. Within 5 sentences the problem was visible. A scribe had carried the accusation from a ruined scriptorium into the market, and the city would answer. The occult researcher watched Jonah's jaw tremble as he read line after line. He knew Jonah from the scriptorium, Jonah who had pressed the same parchment into his hands that candlelit night when he whispered, "We accuse the Holy One of allowing our children to die." That earlier accusation hung behind every eye at the gate, a remembered quarrel now made law by public voice. The occult researcher tightened the strap of his satchel and moved closer, because outrage demanded documentation and action. The market smelled of roasting onions, damp straw, and warmed leather. People gathered quickly, trading curses and questions. "What is this?" a butcher called. Jonah answered with a trembling voice, read it. "Hear the charges." He sounded like a man who knew the words could get him killed. The occult researcher stepped onto a low crate to better see Jonah's face. He did not speak yet. His hand rested on the leather grimoire at his hip, the brass spectacles catching the late light. Miriam elbowed through the crowd and placed herself near Jonah. She carried a small iron token and a linen bundle bound with twine. "Miriam," someone said. "Miriam, do not inflame them." Miriam looked toward the occult researcher and then at Jonah. Her mouth was a hard line. Cantor Lev arrived shortly after, singing no melody but speaking with clipped authority. "Cantor Lev," someone repeated, "what will you do?" Cantor Lev touched the manuscript grooves he kept under his habit and said, "We will not let this become a riot. There is procedure." The occult researcher recognized the tonal shift. Outrage had seeded a council question. Do we act as ritual or as crime? The first emotion shift came when outrage moved to suspicion. A man near the gate hissed, "This paper is stained with oil and water. It was written in my neighbor's home. He died last week." The crowd turned. Faces shifted from communal anger toward pointed fingers. Jonah's voice faltered. "I wrote it here," he said, and the words sounded small. The occult researcher felt suspicion and tightened his grip on his pen. He wrote the word "suspicion" in the margin of his notebook, then rubbed the ink with his thumb to keep the page usable. They decided to carry the parchment to the ruined scriptorium at dusk. The decision produced the second emotion shift, from suspicion into fierce determination. Miriam clasped the linen bundle to her chest and said, "We follow the rubric our mothers taught. We will demand an answer." Cantor Lev folded his hands and recited part of the liturgy that was also law. "Cantor Lev," the occult researcher quietly. "We should prepare the wording to avoid sedition charges." Cantor Lev snapped, "Do not lecture me. We do this correctly or not at all." The exchange broke into quick back and forth lines that sharpened the stakes. They moved as a small procession through narrow streets. People parted around Jonah and the occult researcher. The scribe kept looking back, as if expecting soldiers. The occult researcher catalogued each step: who held the torch, who carried the iron ring used to mark trials, where the marginal notes had been slipped under doors. Concrete details mattered. He noticed a smear of soot on Jonah's sleeve and the fresh cut on the scribe's knuckle where the nail had torn wood. He tapped his spectacles and spoke to Miriam in a low voice. "Miriam, the iron ring has to be whole. It marks the jurisdiction." Miriam lowered the linen bundle and answered, "It has been polished. I saw it this morning." Her fingers flexed around the bundle. Inside the ruined scriptorium, candlelight threw long, exact shadows across overturned benches and scattered parchments. The room smelled of damp vellum. The occult researcher set his grimoire on the ritual table and cleared 3 lines with his hand to create space for Jonah's charges. He read parts of the scroll aloud again into the hush. "We accuse the Holy One of allowing our children to die." He repeated slowly, as if testing the phrase against the room. Miriam opened the linen bundle and revealed a small iron ring and a brittle seal matrix. Cantor Lev placed his palm on the table and said, "The words must be precise. We are not monsters. We are seekers of account." Tension increased as they argued the wording. The magistrate appeared on the threshold, Magistrate Asher with 2 civic men. He wore a short mantle and a face like a ledger. "Magistrate Asher." Cantor Lev with forced calm, "You cannot interrupt ritual." Asher's voice had the authority of law. "This will be judged by civic law if it becomes sedition," he warned. The room's energy tightened. Jonah moved behind Miriam, avoiding Asher's gaze. The occult researcher watched Asher's fingers tap his belt where a seal ring hung. Asher plainly, "If I find you have declared the divine at fault in a manner that incites, I will see arrests made." Miriam answered, "Asher, we only seek covenantal process." Asher replied, "Covenant or crime, the city decides." The confrontation placed the ritualists and the civic authority on a collision course. A clerk came in then, carrying a small wooden box with ink and wax. He set it down and opened to reveal a sheet with the sacred trial seal. The seal lay nicked. "Someone had scored the outer edge. The seal has been defaced," the clerk said, and his voice was flat. Fingers pointed toward the door. Cantor Lev moved to inspect. His face hardened. "Who touched the seal?" Miriam demanded. Jonah shook his head and said, Not I. The room narrowed into accusation and counter-accusation. Suspicion erupted into distrust. The occult researcher watched how their trust frayed into sharp exchanges. The occult researcher confronted Lev directly at the ritual table. Lev, your rubrics were altered. The marginalia mute the accusation in places, he said. Lev's eyes narrowed. You accuse me. He snapped. Yes, the occult researcher replied. These notes were changed to remove culpability from certain passages. The two traded short lines. You show me proof. Lev, if you have proof, show it now. The exchange became a rapid string of questions and denials that echoed in the scriptorium. Voices rose. Miriam stood between them and banged the table with her palm. Stop, she said. Jonah found a note. Let him speak. The argument exposed fractures inside the group. Jonah produced the marginalia he had secreted in his sleeve, a narrow slip of parchment folded twice and stained with wash water. He smoothed it on the table. The note reframes the trial as old covenant practice. Jonah, his voice steadier than earlier. It says our ancestors used the trial to compel divine reckoning within communal law. Lev leaned in and read the handwriting. His mouth tightened. This undermines our liturgical guardrails, he said. Miriam smiled briefly. This gives us cover under old law, she said. Not cover. Asher interrupted from the entrance. A loophole is still a trap. The city does not permit separate laws. The discovery reframed their moral argument into legal maneuver. The occult researcher marked the marginalia verbatim into his notebook. The small room rebalanced, then fell apart. A civic detachment arrived without warning, boots clattering on the threshold. Magistrate Asher stepped forward and declared, "By my authority I name this meeting unlawful. Arrest those who attempt to bind the divine to human judgment." Soldiers moved in. A scuffle began. Lev shoved a civic man and one of Asher's deputies caught him by the arm. Jonah tried to reach for the iron ring. A soldier slammed his shoulder into Jonah's chest. The occult researcher lunged to pull Jonah back and felt his coat tear. Someone struck a candle and the iron ring fell from its hook. The ring struck the stone and split with a clear metallic crack. The ritual was interrupted and the symbol was broken. That moment served as the chapter's climax. The ring breaking sounded like the end of an agreement. Hands grabbed, cords snapped, and the ritual papers scattered across the floor. Jonah was seized and cuffed. Lev was hauled backward, shouting, "You will not silence the law of covenant." Miriam shoved a bench under a window and kicked out a shard of glass to hide the fragile parchments. The occult researcher, with ink-stained fingers, shoved several manuscripts into his satchel and jammed Jonah's folded marginalia into his sleeve. The room stank of smoke from a toppled lamp. The occult researcher felt a cold clarity. Preserve the record now or lose it. He chose preservation. After the arrests, the camp of civic men formed a rough perimeter outside the scriptorium. Voices argued in the street. The magistrate read aloud a short proclamation declaring the act heresy. Citizens murmured and some applauded. Miriam dragged a small crate into a secret alcove under the bench. She handed the occult researcher a sealed bundle and whispered, "Keep these safe. If you lose them, we lose history and the truth of our charge." His hands closed around the bundle. "Miriam," he said, "I will not fail you." She pressed the iron token into his palm and stepped away toward a group of women who were being questioned. The occult researcher left by a back stair while the magistrate's men dragged Jonah through the courtyard. He moved under low archways, avoiding torches. He counted addresses as he moved, where manuscripts could be hidden quickly, which friends could be trusted to move books. He arrived at a narrow alcove beneath the scriptorium and set the sealed bundle in a carved niche. His fingers were slick with wax. He pressed the seal and placed the grimoire on top to weigh it down. He wrote a single line in his notebook. "Preserve Jonah's marginalia. Catalogue 3 copies. Deliver to Miriam's sister if I am detained." The act itself was the vow. The vow contained a next step. At dawn, an extinguished candle cooled on the ritual table, and the city smelled of wet stone and boiled porridge. The occult researcher returned to the scriptorium threshold to check who had been taken. He counted the empty bench, the broken ring, the gouged seal. He recorded a list of names and who had fled. He heard the distant sound of a cart and assumed the magistrate was taking prisoners to the hall. He packed his satchel and put Jonas marginalia into a hidden pocket. Miriam's face passed through his mind, her hands, the iron token, the way she had spoken of covenant. A mid-chapter cliffhanger occurred when he opened his satchel and found the brass spectacles scratched across one lens. He froze because scratched spectacles could slow his work and leave him blind to small marginalia. He set them aside and, with trembling hands, put in the grimoire and the sealed bundle. He checked the door. No one stood in the alley. The occult researcher took a breath that tasted of smoke and ink. He slid the satchel under his coat and began to walk away from the scriptorium, planning his route to the safe houses he had set in the past. He moved through alleys and kept watch on the magistrate's patrols. He met Gittel, a friend who ran a dye shop and had sheltered books before. Gittel, the occult researcher. "I must leave these copies hidden under the floorboards in your back room." Gittel nodded and said, "Leave them now. I will place them beneath the heavy chest when the cart leaves." Their exchange was quick and precise. He delivered one copy and told her where to find Jonas' original marginalia if he failed. He then moved to a pottery kiln where Miriam's sister worked. He left instructions folded inside a shard of clay behind a stack of plates. Each action was a choice to distribute risk. By late morning, the magistrate had posted notice of inquiry. The city bled into cautious whispers. Families closed shutters. A cantor from another quarter asked the occult researcher, "Will you return to testify?" He answered, "I will write what I saw if I cannot speak." The records must survive. The occult researcher felt exhaustion step in, a tiredness of a man who had been awake for nights, reading marginalia and cross, checking scribal hands. He placed his hand on the pocket that housed Jonas' marginalia and felt the folded edge press into his palm. A surprise revealed itself when a clerk who had earlier reported the defaced seal returned with a small folded note addressed to the occult researcher. The note contained a single line of script in an older hand and a sketch of a location beyond the city walls where an archive of covenantal rulings might be hidden. The occult researcher read it twice in the kiln's shadow. The note changed his angle. The marginalia might not be an isolated practice, but part of a wider, older legal tradition. This plot twist shifted how he understood the accusation from local blasphemy to potential reclaimed law. He felt a fresh urgency. The trial's meaning expanded. He spent noon cataloging what he could in the hidden alcove. He recorded the seal's damage, wrote down the names of the arrested, and listed the manuscripts taken or concealed. He made a plan to travel at sunset with Miriam's sister to the safe archive beyond the walls if the magistrate escalated. The occult researcher knew the city would either smother the story or let it spread. He had to act to keep an accurate record for later scholarship and for the community that had risked itself in the charge. The chapter ended with a concrete situational beat. He zipped the satchel and replaced his brass spectacles. He strapped the iron token to the grimoire's cover and set his hand on the door as if to leave for the outer road where the old archive lay. Then a single, sharp knock sounded on the outer stair, 3 measured taps. He paused, listening to each tap strike the wood. He did not reach for a speech. He moved slowly to the stair and opened the door a fraction. A courier stood there, cloak sodden from the dawn and a small waxed packet in his hand. "For you," the courier said, naming him. The occult researcher took the packet. He felt the city's answer arriving in a single folded bundle, and he stepped into the light with the sealed documents tucked close, choosing the next move with the same careful, intolerant clarity that had guided him since Jonah first nailed the accusation to the gate. Jonah slammed the parchment down. "We accuse the Holy One," he said, voice raw enough to cut bone. Betrayal drove the room. People leaned forward, hands knuckled white, mouth set to argue or scream. The occult researcher did not speak. He set his grimoire on the table and watched the iron ring where the accusation landed. Within 5 breaths the chamber filled with bodies. The ring sat on stone beneath an empty wooden throne. Oil lamps guttered near the walls. The occult researcher checked his brass spectacles, then pushed them up and traced the margin of the indictment with an ink-stained fingertip. He moved toward the ring because the researcher's duty is to record, but also because the first duty of a witness is not to let the record lie. The central conflict was immediate and visible. The community wanted juridical procedure, and some elders wanted restraint. That problem shaped everything that followed. Jonah hammered the paper. Elder Asa stepped forward to read. Rabbi Miriam reached for the hinge of the shutter door. The occult researcher remembered the earlier morning when Jonah had bled candle wax onto that same parchment. He had seen the stain then, and now its stain met the iron with fresh intent. Rabbi Miriam's voice broke first. "Jonah," she said, "this is not law. This is a rage ritual." She it plainly, each word shaped to calm. Her hands stayed flat against the table, fingers splayed. People turned. "This is law," Jonah answered. He jabbed a finger at the indictment. "This is the law we can write when the law of heaven does not answer." He spoke the name Jonah like a verdict. His jaw worked. He did not yield the ring. Elder Asa cleared his throat and stepped to the torchlight. "We will read the charges," he said. "We will swear. We will not burn the book here." He unrolled a second parchment with neat, even strokes. Scribe Yitzchak moved to his side with a fresh quill, ink dripping at the nib. Tamar waited with a blanket over her shoulders at the ring's edge. She held 2 folded hems that smelled of sweat and dishwater. The occult researcher noticed the way her knuckles creased the cloth when she pressed them together. He noted that detail and did not yet move to speak. A record must first catch what is done. Dialogue snapped like wire between them. "You ask for practices, Rabbi Miriam. You will not make law with grief alone." "We will," Jonah spat back. "We will if the heavens refuse to answer us. This will ruin the community, Asa. It will call down not justice but chaos. We answer with the only procedure left to us, Jonah. We push heaven to account. We make it answer." The voices traded in short lines. Each name appeared with each line, a map to who held which temper. The occult researcher leaned close to Scribe Yitzchak as the formal indictment was unrolled. "Read slowly," he murmured, and Yitzchak nodded. The researcher recorded every line, not in a dry ledger but in the marginal pattern a scribe leaves, minute flourishes that show where a hand trembled, where a phrase was underlined in anger. He felt an emotion rising that he could name: betrayal. That feeling pushed him to move faster, to mark the subtle corrections Asa made when he thought no one watched. A first external event changed the rhythm. Elder Asa began the oath. "Swear by the lamp," he intoned, "by the seat of Abraham, by the witness of our dead." 3 voices replied, then 20. The assembly repeated after him. The ring took the sound hard. Every footfall registered. People bent to touch the iron with palms slick from work and grief. That act turned private complaint into public procedure. Rabbi Miriam stepped away from the table and spoke to a cluster of women near the shadowed shelf. "Tamar," she said, "wait. Let us not make a law that will name God liable without proof." Tamar's hands trembled, but she did not back away. "Rabbi Miriam," Tamar replied, "proof is the child's body. Proof is the empty cradle." Tamar's voice dropped into a close, raw cadence. The room shifted toward memory of a morning the occult researcher had been shown earlier. A mother closing a small lid over tiny linen. He had written the date in his notes then. Now it returned, a second external event. Scribe Yitzchak began copying the formal indictment onto a new sheet, using the older margins as template. The occult researcher moved to Scribe Yitzchak's small table at the chamber's edge and opened a battered folio he had brought. He wanted to compare phrasing. He ran a fingertip over a fold and found a hidden marginal note, slanted and quick, squeezed into a margin that had seemed blank when he first glanced at it earlier in the night. He read the marginalia aloud, low enough that only scribe Yitzhak, and he could hear it. "The line here is not original," he said. Scribe Yitzhak's nostrils flared. "It changes prayers into charges," the occult researcher added. Someone shifted the phrasing to pull legal language into liturgy. His hand hovered above the note, the ink dark as if recent. This discovery bent the room's direction. Jonah heard the whispered finding and strode across the ring. "Who wrote this?" he demanded. "Who turned our prayer into a charge?" His face was set. Grief shone through it like a burn. He looked to Rabbi Miriam for an answer. She stepped forward, palms up. "I do not see who has the ink, Rabbi Miriam, but this changes the ground. If someone rewrote the language, we must know why." Her voice steadied. Her authority had been a margin the whole evening. Now she brought it forward like a measure. The accused elders became the accused in turn. Who benefits? Jonah, who moves our anger where they wish? Questions ricocheted through the chamber. Elder Asa raised both hands. "We will present witnesses," he said. "We will not leap to blame the office of the Lord without proof of manipulation." He meant the manipulation of ritual language could be human, not divine. A confrontation erupted in quick, clipped lines. "Jonah, Rabbi Miriam, did you or did you not counsel certain wordings in last year's prayer?" Rabbi Miriam answered, "I advised modesty in phrase, not legal assault." Elder Asa cut in, "You advised caution." "I advised exact listing of harms. You both shaped the petition." Jonah snapped, but someone slipped legal clauses into the margins. The room's voices hit a cadence of accusation and defense. There were 5 rapid back and forth lines as the rules demanded. Jonah, Rabbi Miriam, Elder Asa, Jonah Asa. The occult researcher stepped between 2 men near the throne and lifted his hand. He spoke with measured pauses and a resonant baritone. "Record this exactly," he said. "I will read the marginalia into the roll, and we will note every name who touched those pages." He showed the note to scribe Yitzhak. Yitzhak's face paled. He had been copying text all evening and had not noticed the insertion. A third external event arrived. Tamar came forward, voice unsteady, and told of the morning her child stopped breathing. "I prayed until my voice broke," she said. "I beat my chest. I called the elders. I called the doctors." The body was cold at dusk. Her hands opened the cloth she carried and revealed a tiny worn sandal. People inhaled. Jonah swore and paced. He grabbed the sandal and held it as if it were evidence on a trial table. He pressed it to his chest. The room's tone shifted. Betrayal moved toward fury, and doubt edged in where the marginal note suggested human interference. The occult researcher felt the emotion shift. Betrayal to suspicion. He recorded the sandal's stitching, the jag of a repair, the trace of ash on the sole. He watched how fingers gripped the sandal. He watched how Jonah's jaw tightened until the scar at his temple, one he had noticed before, showed white along the skin. Scribe Yitzhak read aloud the new formal list of charges while the assembly took binding oaths. Each charge named an omission. Withheld healing, failed watch, ignored cries. The language had been sharpened into legal terms now, and the community's faces hardened with comprehension and fury. This was the build-up. The occult researcher saw the lines where grievance became policy. Halfway through the reading, the occult researcher remembered a previous scene at the gate when Jonah had hammered the parchment, and the crowd had answered. He felt the story loop back on itself. The marginal note raised the possibility that someone guided that crowd's anger. He moved to the shelf where older manuscripts lay and pulled a parchment with similar marginalia. The handwriting matched the note he had just found. He called out, "This hand repeats." "Look here," people clustered. Rabbi Miriam bent over the text. "This is Yitzhak's father's hand," she said. "No," Asa interrupted, "that hand has been gone 10 years. A murmur rose. Jonah moved close and tasted the air as if to find a scent of proof. This reveal twisted the tribunal. The accusers turned on the elders. Jonah shouted, "You brought those words in! You shaped the ritual to corner us?" Rabbi Miriam pushed back. "I did not write that note." Elder Asa stepped into Jonah and said, "I am no forger." The assembly broke into shouted lines. The short exchanges sharp and fast. Jonah named Rabbi Miriam and Asa repeatedly, driving the accusation home. The occult researcher recorded names, ink strokes, and who said what. He watched as alliances cracked. Some in the crowd sided with Jonah, others with the elders. Fingers pointed. Someone struck a table. A lamp tilted and a drop of oil sizzled on stone. The ritual procedure collapsed into chaos. That was the second major twist, an unexpected reveal that changed the direction of blame away from the abstract and toward people in the room. Then the tribunal reached its single decisive peak. Everyone demanded a verdict. Voices rose to a roar. Jonah's voice became a machine. Rabbi Miriam attempted a last measured appeal. Elder Asa banged the table. The occult researcher stood at the margin and felt a physical pull in his chest, his pulse close to his ear. He lifted his brass watch. It kept slow time. At the moment the assembly named a verdict, the chamber produced a sign. A thin column of smoke rose from the base of the empty throne. It formed a dark, ringed burn on the throne's plinth and spread like oil into the wood grain. The lamps did not flicker. The flame was not visible at first. The smoke smelled of iron and something scorched under flame. People froze. Jonah's hand dropped. Tamar's fingers loosened their hold on the sandal. The occult researcher bent as if to study the mark, then straightened. Silence became a weight. Someone, no one could say who, whispered, "Is this a sign?" Rabbi Miriam took a step toward the throne and felt a small heat. Her breath came shallow. "Touch it," Jonah to her, but his voice had fallen to a frightened slide. Rabbi Miriam reached out and pressed the pad of her thumb to the burn. The wood was neither hot nor cold. It resisted sensation. Voices fractured into two roads. Divine culpability or human treachery. "Jonah, this proves the heavens answer with a wound," Rabbi Miriam replied. "It proves nothing unless we know who made it," Asa barked. "Someone artfully staged this sign to sway us." The occult researcher watched the choice compress into a knife edge. He saw the emotional shift. Suspicion moved to dread for some, to fury for others. Then a new, concrete reveal. Scribe Yitzhak overturned his ink pot in his haste to reach the throne, and his sleeve smeared black across the parchment he had been copying. Under the smear, a faint impression showed a wax seal pressed and marked, an iron ring pressed into warm wax, the same iron ring as the trial marker. Yitzhak stammered. He began. People surrounded him. 3 rapid exchanges followed. "Jonah accused, you staged it," he said to Yitzhak. Yitzhak, "No, I was copying." Rabbi Miriam, "Who touched the ring before this night?" Asa demanded evidence. The phone, like quickness of the lines, left listeners leaning in. Yitzhak crumpled his hands. Ink darkened his nails. Sensing both a legal and moral rupture, the occult researcher flipped the folio to an older note. The texture of the page matched a time when someone had practiced the ritual at a lower light. He found a second matching wax impression, faint and handled. It carried fingerprints in the soft impression. Jonah called for those fingerprints to be compared to those present now. Rabbi Miriam demanded calm. The assembly broke. Some pushed toward Yitzhak. Others pressed to the throne. Jonah shoved past Asa. A lamp tipped and guttered. A chair slammed back. The ring itself scraped as men dragged it aside. Voices became commands. The occult researcher moved with a scholar's economy. He lifted the fallen lamps to steady them. He put his hand on the parchment, as if to shield the words from tears. He recorded every shove and every name that cried out. A person in the back, a minor figure until now, spoke up with an unexpected line. "We found wax on the ring days ago. I told no one because I feared reprisal." The voice belonged to an apprentice smith, known in the community as Haran. Haran had been mentioned once in passing earlier by the researcher in a note about repairs to the ring. His admission changed the case. The sign might be human after all. People turned to him. Jonah's fists tightened. Harren explained in clipped lines, "I thought to test what the elders would do. I burned a scrap, only to see if the ring responded. I found nothing. Then I left." He kept his head down. The room's anger shifted again, anger to dismay to a narrower, pointed blame. Jonah shouted, "You toyed with our grief." The occult researcher recorded Harren's words and the way Jonah strode toward him. The climax left the tribunal in pieces. Some demanded that Harren be punished. Others wanted an impartial hearing. Rabbi Miriam called for restraint, but her voice lacked the majority it had earlier in the night. Elder Asa stepped into the gap and said, "We will take witnesses and compare the wax impressions tomorrow at light. We will not execute judgment on rumor." Jonah seized a scrap of parchment and ripped it, then folded it and shoved it into his robe. He muttered, "We will not wait for their slow law." He left the ring, leaving the assembly broken. Chaos spilled into the stairwell. Some pressed for immediate vengeance. Others fled. Jonah walked toward the stair and stumbled, then stood, head bowed. Tamar clutched the sandal to her chest and sobbed. Rabbi Miriam stood at the ring and watched the men file out like sheep. Elder Asa remained near the torch and watched Jonah go. The occult researcher followed at a measured distance, noting the print of Jonah's boots on the worn stone. At dawn the chamber looked different. A single extinguished lamp lay on the floor. Papers were torn. The ring sat scuffed and cold. The occult researcher catalogued the ruined parchments and the wax impressions, noting each smear, each fold. He packed the revised indictment, the original marginalia, and the newer copies into his worn leather satchel. He set his brass spectacles beside them and clicked his pocket watch closed. He spoke once to Scribe Yitzhak as they stood at the stair. "You must list every hand that touched those pages." Yitzhak nodded and began. He spoke slowly. "I copied and recopied at night. I handled the wax." "My father," he stopped. He had said too much. The occult researcher recorded the pause. He had seen how names surfaced under pressure. He made a note to compare the impressions with the ones from the smith's bench. The final twist threaded through the dawn. A small burned scrap of cloth fell from Jonah's robe as he left. It matched the battered sandal's stitching. Tamar picked it up and held it out. Jonah did not turn. Rabbi Miriam reached for the scrap and examined the thread. She found a faded stitch pattern that matched the seam of more than one child's sandal sold by the same maker in the lane outside the market. She nothing, but the look on her face told the occult researcher she had begun to doubt the simplicity of blame. The chapter's conflicts closed without tidy justice. Some left in anger, some in shame. Harren would answer for the manipulation of ritual signs, and yet the marginal notes and the wax impressions demanded further investigation. The occult researcher catalogued names, signatures, and an array of ink strokes that traced not only guilt, but the brittle architecture of communal authority. He saw that the tribunal's effort to hold Divinity accountable had revealed the ways humans could steer accusation for their own ends. In the final paragraph, the occult researcher gathered the parchments and stepped toward the door. His satchel felt heavier because it held not only paper, but the sound of names and the weight of decisions. He reached the stair and heard a single heavy footfall above him. He looked up, closed the satchel, and rose to follow the step. Emotion route. Betrayal, emotion shifts. Betrayal, suspicion, fury. Suspicion, dread, resolve.